A night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury. That was a real joke doctors told each other in the 16th century. It was also, horrifyingly, medical fact. For nearly 400 years, the standard cure for one of history's most feared diseases was a toxic heavy metal. Doctors rubbed it into skin. They injected it into veins. They sealed patients inside wooden boxes and forced them to breathe its vapor. Patients often could not tell whether they were dying from the disease or from the cure. This is the story of how mercury became medicine, and how long it took anyone to admit it was killing people the entire time. In the late 15th century, a new disease appeared in Europe with terrifying speed. Some called it the French disease. The French called it the Neapolitan disease. Everyone blamed someone else. Today, we call it syphilis. It arrived, most historians believe, around 1494, spreading rapidly through soldiers, sailors, and the general population. But this disease was different. It did not simply kill quickly. It transformed the body slowly, publicly, and horrifyingly. The first stage brought sores, painless, but visible. The second stage brought rashes, fever, and swollen lymph nodes. And then, for many, came the third stage. Years later, sometimes decades later, tumors that ate through skin and bone, collapsed noses, blindness, madness. Syphilis did not just kill you. It could unmake your face, your mind, and your reputation. Europeans needed a cure. Any cure. Mercury was not, however, the first cure Europe reached for. Years before mercury became standard practice, a different substance swept across Europe as the miracle answer to syphilis. Guaiacum, a dense tropical wood imported from the Caribbean, ground into powder and brewed into a bitter medicinal tea. It arrived with a story attached, one that made it irresistible. Indigenous peoples in the New World, so the story went, had used this same wood for centuries to treat the very disease that Europe now blamed on contact with those same lands. To 16th century minds, this felt like poetic justice. The same distant shores that had supposedly delivered the disease had also, conveniently, delivered its cure. There was just one problem. The wood did nothing. But for a brief, extraordinarily profitable period, almost nobody in power wanted to say so out loud. The reason had very little to do with medicine, and everything to do with money. The import trade for Guaiacum was controlled almost entirely by one family, the Fuggers, a German banking dynasty who also happened to be among the largest creditors of the Holy Roman Emperor himself. The Fuggers funded hospitals that treated syphilis patients exclusively with Guaiacum. They funded physicians who wrote glowing medical texts praising its effectiveness. They funded pamphlets distributed across Europe insisting this was, without question, the true cure. For roughly 2 decades, Guaiacum was not simply a treatment. It was a business empire, built almost entirely on a cure that quietly, consistently, failed to cure anyone. Patients drank the bitter tea for weeks. They sweated in heated rooms, believing the treatment required intense warmth to work. And their sores, exactly as with mercury, sometimes faded on their own regardless of anything they swallowed. Eventually, physicians outside the Fuggers' financial orbit began quietly comparing notes. Patients treated with Guaiacum alone were not recovering any faster or any more reliably than patients given no treatment whatsoever. By the 1520s, the Guaiacum craze had largely collapsed. The wood was expensive, imported, and, most damning of all, it simply did not work any better than doing nothing at all. Physicians turned back to the substance they had used before, and would continue using for the next 4 centuries. Cheaper, already familiar, and, as we will see, just as capable of doing harm. And in their desperation, they found one that seemed almost too convenient to be true. Mercury was not new to medicine. Ancient physicians in China, India, and the Islamic world had used it for centuries. Mercury has one genuinely useful property. It is mildly effective against certain skin parasites and bacterial infections. European physicians noticed something else, something that seemed like confirmation. When they applied mercury ointments to the visible sores of syphilis patients, the sores sometimes appeared to heal. To 16th century medicine, this looked like proof. What they did not understand was that syphilis naturally cycles between active and dormant phases regardless of treatment. The sores would have faded on their own, but correlation looked exactly like causation to physicians who desperately wanted an answer. And so mercury became the treatment, not just for the skin, for everything. By the early 16th century, mercury treatment had become a full medical industry. The mildest was mercury ointment, rubbed directly onto the skin, sometimes for weeks at a time. More aggressive physicians used mercury pills, swallowed by patients desperate enough to try anything. But the most notorious treatment was fumigation. Patients were sealed inside a wooden box or a specially built chamber. Mercury was heated inside the chamber until it produced vapor. The patient sat inside, breathing the fumes for hours, sometimes for days. The theory was that the vapor would penetrate the body and drive out the disease from within. In reality, the patient was inhaling a neurotoxin directly into their lungs, at concentrations far higher than any ointment could achieve. Physicians of the era believed the human body operated on a balance of fluids. If a disease was present, they believed, it needed to be expelled. Sweat, vomit, diarrhea, and, in the case of mercury treatment, saliva. This is where the treatment took its darkest turn. Mercury poisoning causes a specific and severe symptom: excessive, uncontrollable salivation. Rather than recognizing this as a sign of poisoning, physicians interpreted it as evidence the treatment was working. The disease, they believed, was being flushed out through the mouth. Doctors actually measured the volume of saliva produced as a way of tracking treatment progress. Patients undergoing severe mercury treatment could produce several pints of saliva per day. Some accounts describe patients drooling continuously for weeks. Along with the salivation came the other symptoms of heavy metal poisoning: loosened teeth, bleeding gums, tremors in the hands, ulcerated mouths so severe that eating became impossible, and in the worst cases, kidney failure and death. The treatment that was supposed to save patients from syphilis was, in many cases, simply killing them. What is perhaps most disturbing about this history is not that the treatment was wrong. It is how long everyone agreed it was right. Mercury remained the primary treatment for syphilis for nearly 4 centuries. Generations of physicians trained believing it was effective. Medical textbooks described precise dosing schedules. Patients who survived the treatment were considered cured, even when their symptoms simply entered a dormant phase. Patients who died during treatment were often recorded as having died from the disease itself. This was not simple ignorance. It was a system where an entire medical establishment reinforced its own errors for hundreds of years, because the alternative was admitting they had been poisoning patients since the Renaissance. Some physicians did raise doubts over the centuries, but without a clear alternative treatment, skepticism rarely changed practice. The joke about Venus and Mercury persisted for a reason. Everyone half knew the cure was almost as dangerous as the disease. They kept using it anyway. The beginning of the end came not from a better understanding of mercury. It came from Germany, in the early 20th century. Paul Ehrlich, a physician and researcher, was searching for what he called a magic bullet, a compound that could kill a specific pathogen without poisoning the patient in the process. In 1909, after testing hundreds of chemical compounds, Ehrlich's laboratory identified compound number 606, an arsenic-based drug that specifically targeted the bacterium that causes syphilis. It was named Salvarsan. For the first time in 400 years, physicians had something that worked. Salvarsan itself was not perfect. It still carried real risks. But compared to mercury, it was a revolution. Mercury treatment did not disappear overnight. Old practices persisted in some places for years. But the era of the fumigation box, the salivation cure, and the joke about Venus and Mercury was finally ending. Penicillin, discovered decades later, would eventually make syphilis a treatable, curable disease, with none of the horror that had defined its treatment for centuries. The history of mercury treatment is not just a story about a strange medical mistake. It is a story about how medicine actually progresses, not in straight lines, not through obvious discoveries, but slowly, stubbornly, often for centuries, before someone finally asks the right question. For 400 years, the cure and the disease competed to see which would kill the patient first. Sometimes the cure won. That is not a comfortable story, but it is a true one, and it is worth remembering. The next time medicine feels certain of itself,